Hi, from Brown Dog Studios, I'm Rob, and welcome to Policy G, Take It From Me.
Take it from you?
Well, not really from me, but we'll be taking it from you, Susan. So let's jump right in. Susan, what is Policy G, Take It From Me, all about?
Well, first I should probably explain that Policy G stands for policy governance, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. But someone suggested that I do a podcast. They were looking around for a podcast about governance or policy governance and couldn't find anything. And so obviously there's popular demand for a podcast about governance, right? So why not do it? So that's one reason why we're doing this podcast. Secondly, I do have to admit a lot of times I feel this great sense of frustration that everybody doesn't understand policy governance, or it's not in widespread use. It's not like the default method for boards yet these days. So I want to kind of both express that frustration and also turn it into something good. I keep thinking of my good friend, dearly departed colleague, Caroline Oliver, and she always had a great way of being positive about everything, no matter what. So I want to do something positive and also, share some stories, some advice, take questions, and maybe build a little bit of a community or stimulate the growth of a community around good governance and policy governance in particular.
Well, it's certainly a word we hear used a lot. Governance, I think, is more in the common vocabulary than it used to, but what is governance anyway?
Well, yeah, good question. I have a YouTube video actually called What is Governance? It's got well over 100,000 views, if you can believe it. It's my most viral video. But in a nutshell, it's the job of a board of directors. And so when you think of all the different organizations that impact our lives, all of these organizations are led by some kind of group of people at the top, whether it's called a board of directors, a board of trustees, a legislative body. They are a group of people with a really, really important leadership job to do. And people kind of think they know what that job is, but they don't. It does take some learning. And so governance, and we will talk a lot more about what governance really means throughout this podcast. But for now, let's just suffice to say it's the job of a board of directors, and it's about turning expectations into results.
So that's governance writ large in the larger sense of what is governance. And of course, it's quite distinct from management. So, what specifically is policy governance?
Okay, so policy governance, capital P, capital G, policy governance is a well defined set of principles put together or designed by Dr. John Carver. He's based in Atlanta. And he designed this set of principles way back in 1976. When you learn and use these 10 principles as a board of directors, you basically have a system to deal with everything that can come to the attention of the board of directors, or anything that happens in the organization. You basically have a system to deal with it. Do you remember that time someone found a finger in the chili at Wendy's? Do you remember that?
I don't think they charged extra for it,
Well, there was that whole scandal, like somebody found a finger, a severed finger in their chili.
which is
And
wrong. It's just plain.
yeah,
It's just plain wrong.
yeah, exactly. But the thing is about that incident, when you look at the sort of the case study of what happened there, all the time, the higher ups at Wendy's knew that there was no way that a finger could have come off, somebody in the chili factory and ended up in a chili that then gets served to a customer. They knew that that was not possible. And you know why they knew? Because they had systems in place. They had all kinds of like health and safety systems in place that they knew that was not possible. So we're used to relying on systems in so many other areas of life, like management systems, HR systems, IT systems, having a system in place to create a consistently good result is taken for granted. It's really what helps our society work as well as it does. But what's missing is boards of directors having a system to do their job. So that's what policy governance is. We'll get into it a lot more throughout these podcasts, but in a nutshell, that's what policy governance is. Thank you for asking.
Well, it sounds a bit like common sense, and to some people, it might sound a little boring and complicated, but it's very important. And policy governance is an organized system to approach that. So, how many boards use PG?
Ha. So we don't really know. There are millions and millions of boards of directors all around the world that are working in nonprofit organizations that are the head of for-profit corporations, public organizations, and so there's many different types of organizations all around the world that are using policy governance through all these spheres. You commonly hear about it in, school boards, credit unions, food co-ops, membership organizations. But if you think of all the boards of directors around the world, millions and millions of them, there's gotta be a very small percentage that are using anything, like policy governance. So it's a very small percentage, and that's what makes me frustrated because it seems to me like the world could be so much of a better place if policy governance was the status quo or the default setting for most boards. Um, I often think of a story that my aunt tells about my grandfather. When my grandfather and grandmother and their 3 kids came to Canada, they landed, the ship came to Pier 21 in Halifax, and they got off the ship and they had to then board a train to Montreal. And the way the story goes, apparently somebody else standing with them on the train platform sort of kicked at the platform and says, "What kind of a shoddy country is this anyway? This train platform is, the wood is rotten and it doesn't look like it's well put together. So, really, like, what kind of country have we just come to?" And my grandfather said, "That's why we're here. That's why we're here." And to me, when I think of that, I think of like that is such a statement that is simultaneously incredibly humble and also very powerful and inspiring as well. And so when I look around and I see, wow, there's so many governance issues all around us, why does it have to be that way? Well, maybe, that's a little bit about why I'm here is to help make that better.
Well, so isn't it true though that some or maybe even most boards would say that, well, of course we have policies and we're governed by them. We're governed by our policies, or they think they're using capital P policy, capital G governance, policy governance, but they're not.
Yeah, we find that a lot. We get a lot of inquiries from organizations where they say they're using policy governance, and through just asking a few questions, we find out, well, actually, no. They just have a few policies in place, or maybe they learned about it and adopted it several years ago, but now they're not really living those principles, as it were. So there's definitely something to learn with any other skill, any other human endeavor where you expect to have excellence. You've got to learn stuff, and so that's my day job is as a consultant for working with boards that want to use policy governance.
Yeah, very good. So who would you say is the audience for this podcast?
Hmm. Good question. You've got to know your audience, right? So I was thinking that there are sort of three main buckets of people who would be interested in this podcast. The first one is people who already know and understand something about policy governance to begin with. They're using it, their board is using it, or they're work for a board that's using policy governance, or maybe they're even another consultant. So that's kind of one obvious group of people who might get a kick out of this podcast. The second would be what I call the PG curious. Those
Mhm.
are people who maybe have heard a little bit about policy governance, or their board is thinking about using it, or they've come across it in their reading and they want to learn more about it. Then this is a great podcast for you as well, of course. And then lastly, the third bucket is all the people who are currently serving on or for a board of directors, and they are experiencing the pain of governance dysfunction. There are so many of you out there, and I really, really feel for those people. I see a lot of encouragement of people to go out there and serve on a board of directors. And I kind of cringe because yes, I think serving on boards is a great idea, and it's a good way to get involved and to make a difference in the world. But there is so much governance dysfunction out there. I feel sorry for those people, and I hope this is a place where they can, find some comfort, some ideas, and maybe get out some of their frustration as well.
Well, you certainly don't have to look too far to find boards who find themselves at dysfunction junction. So, governance dysfunction sounds serious. What are the symptoms?
There are so many symptoms from the very mild to the very serious. The milder symptoms of governance function dysfunction are things like if your board is engaged in conversations that seem very repetitive, like they're going over and over the same issue or topic again and again, and maybe not coming to much of a resolution. Another symptom is when you have board members who are not really engaged, who maybe don't show up for board meetings, or don't seem to participate, or don't do what they say they were going to do. And you'll hear lots of governance dysfunction issues or complaints coming from staff who are so frustrated working with their board because their board never really seems to come to a decision, or the staff present something to the board and it gets rejected. So there are lots of kind of things that sometimes you put down to interpersonal issues, which could be part of the issue, but usually there's a governance solution that's available that nobody's even using. The more extreme examples of governance dysfunction are accountability lapses and gaps, where the staff think the board's accountable for something and the board thinks the staff are accountable for something. And then so now who's accountable? Well, nobody really knows. You look at disasters like that condo collapse in Florida this past year. That was really, really, I mean, that's an extreme example of somebody wasn't doing their job. And if you think of the board as serving at the top of an organization, it's up to them to make sure that good stuff happens and bad stuff doesn't happen, in a nutshell. So we've seen scandals, we've seen examples of embezzlement of funds. So that's a very extreme kind of outcome. Enron, WorldCom collapses, complete jeopardy of an organization. Those are extreme examples where governance dysfunction is definitely at play. And so that's at one end, and then kind of the lazy, boring people and bad meetings is at the other end, and then you've got everything else in between.
Well, so governance dysfunction certainly sounds tough, challenging, probably
Yeah.
complicated, and even demoralizing for board members and staff, probably owners and residents, etc. But what about the average person on the street? What does governance have to do with them?
Well, this is the thing. Our lives are affected by all these organizations around us. Some of them we're aware of, and some of them we're not. And so if all of these organizations are working really, really well, then there'll be good results in the world. There won't be plane crashes, the streets will be well paved, the cities will be clean, people's stock portfolios will be healthy and growing over time, hospitals will be run efficiently, and people will be better, and diseases will be cured. Organizations are hard at work at all that stuff all around us all the time. So it only stands to reason that governance, the job of the board of directors at the top of all of these organizations, is pretty critical. Imagine if you're, looking at some sort of disaster, a plane crash or something. Well, there's so many different organizations that are involved in the ultimate result. Think of air traffic control. Somebody's setting standards for how that works. Someone's setting standards for the safety of airplanes and the safety of our skies. And so all of these organizations need to be doing a really good job. And that starts with the people at the top, the board of directors. So that's why I say governance, it's all around us and it affects us deeply.
Well, so it's not hard to find examples of poor governance or absence of good governance. Why doesn't everybody just use policy governance already?
That's my line. Just use policy governance already. Come on, people. It's not that hard. But exactly. And I don't know the answer to that question. At a conference in 2006 in Scottsdale, there was a speaker there, Gar Alperovitz, and he was kind of trying to comfort us by saying that any kind of major change or cultural evolution in a society takes time. We often think of, say, the civil rights movement as something that really, mainly happened in the 60s. But much well before that, decades before the 60s, there were smaller groups of people gathering around kitchen tables and having conversations. And same with the suffrage movement, right? There's lots of stuff that goes on at a very small level, bit by bit by bit, over the course of time that eventually results in change, but it doesn't happen quickly. So I can only assume that right now we're kind of in the early stages of seeing policy governance become a widespread thing in the world.
All right, let's take a quick commercial break and we'll be right back with more Policy G. Take it from me.
You want to make the world a better place, but how? So much to do, so little time. Well, serving on a board of directors is a great way to help create a better world, especially if that board has a clear system for achieving results. Learning how to be an effective board member used to mean reading big books and going to expensive workshops. But now there's engaging online training. The Board Accelerator is a web-based governance course that lets you learn at your own pace and place. Whether you're considering joining a board or serving on one now, the Board Accelerator gives you key insights and the confidence to be an effective board member. To learn more, visit browndogconsulting.com and click Book a Call. Talk soon.
And we're back. So, what do you make of what's going on with some of the anger, viciousness, division going on with school boards and other boards these days?
Oh, that's really so sad because the job of a board member is so difficult already without all of that stuff. Like the last thing any school board member needs is to be accosted at their home or to be getting angry calls and texts and ranting and raving at school board meetings. It's really makes life so much more difficult than it needs to be. I would put all of what we're seeing again into 3 buckets. I like my buckets, okay? So the first one is the really, really bad stuff, the threats of violence. That kind of level of anger and violence is really difficult, and it might be something that only the police can deal with in some of those really extreme cases. So there's that extreme case bucket that is almost like a legal police kind of issue and enforcement issue that needs to be dealt with. Then what we more commonly see is the anti policy governance outrage, where somehow policy governance is weaponized or people are kind of using it to, pursue an agenda. And in almost all of those cases, it has nothing to do with policy governance at all. They're just using the fact that a board is using the system to kind of, I don't know, blame or air their grievance with the board. But if a board is using policy governance, it's really just like a system. It's like using a calendar or your operating system on your computer. The system itself has no sort of political leaning or anything. So usually when we work with those boards, we help them with their communication strategies and learning how to use policy governance to full effect and to full benefit. So those are situations we can deal with. And then we can also deal with people who just have legitimate concerns that they're bringing to a board of directors, where they want to see results happen more quickly or they want different results to happen. So that's okay. We can deal with boards that are experiencing that as well.
So you've discussed a little bit governance in individual organizations and how important that is, whatever those organizations are. What do you see as the relationship between governance and democracy in a larger sense?
See, this is my baby. I'm from a political science background, right? And so I care deeply about democracy, and I see that good governance, and democracy are very tightly intertwined. Democracy is kind of this huge umbrella that covers a lot of different things about how decisions are made in board meetings, the majority vote, right? That's just something we take for granted. If the vote is 5-4, the 5 wins, not the 4, right? But democracy also encompasses, freedom of the press and human rights and how legislative bodies work and all of that. So it's kind of this big overarching kind of thing that we all really, really care about, and we want it to get better and better over time. Governance to me is more the job of the board of directors. It's democracy in a kind of a microcosm. It's a small scale running of one organization by the board or governing the organization by the board. And so boards use democratic methods, again, like the voting, for example. And what I see is really key for all of this is that you want to have good governance so that you can have new and improved, better democracy. If all of these organizations all around us are governed well, that's only going to help support, enhance, and improve democracy writ large.
Yeah, and I guess in order to achieve that, you need true transparency and accountability, right? And
Mhm.
not opaqueness in an organization or ulterior motives or spurious influences.
Right. Those are, again, additional concepts that are overarching that connect both governance in the small scale way, like for an organization, a board doing its job, with the big picture of our whole sort of democratic society. Accountability, facts, truth, all of that stuff is just really important.
Well, so do you have any advice for boards that are feeling the brunt of what you might call extreme activism?
Yeah, we recently published an article in Board Leadership about that. It's called TikTok Time to Make Policy Governance Easier Already. And I would say my three main pieces of advice for those boards that are challenged by what's going on right now. First of all, just obviously stay calm, stay the course, continue doing what you're doing. Don't give up. Don't, throw the baby out with the bathwater. Keep on keeping on with your job of governing. But the second bit of advice I would have is to definitely learn, be open to learning and the possibility of becoming more confident in the tools at your disposal, in how you're governing and in how you're running meetings. There's always something that board members can learn. And so keep learning about ways that the board can improve and do a better job. And third is to simplify. And that's simplifying both how you govern. There could be lots of things that you're doing that you don't need to do right now that are, a little bit too complicated or take too much time. Right now might be a good time to simplify things as much as you can. So it's simplifying how you govern. And I talk more about that in the article about ways you can simplify, but also simplify your messaging. Try not to get too jargony. Don't get too complicated or cerebral. It's easy for all of us to get really, in our heads about what governance is and how it should work and all that. But any ways you can try and simplify your messaging to appeal to your owners and other stakeholders is going to really kind of help you stay the course through this difficult period.
And also with communication with whatever your public is, it could be owners or residents or voters, shareholders, parents. So key messages are important, and they are key messages. They're not a PowerPoint presentation just boiled down into bullets, and it's not a full article broken out into bullets. Key messages are four, five, six, maybe a few more at most. And they would be the key points you want to make if you've got a limited amount of time to tell somebody about it, say in an elevator discussion. So have some key messages ready, especially if you have a spokesperson for public meetings or media or shareholder meetings, etc.
Right. Key messages can definitely help a lot. I would even say maybe 3 to 5 max, right? But the board should kind of try and develop those, be all on the same page. Everybody could have a copy of them if anybody is caught, in the situation where they have to respond to an owner or somebody on the street. And that really helps boards communicate what they're doing and why. Whenever you make it overly complicated, your message gets lost.
And that could be the answer to the question. Somebody says, what is this policy governance?
Right.
And why are you using it or planning to use it? And why is it good? And how is it going to benefit people? So key messages are pretty simple and key and basic and few in number.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And we help boards with that as well. It's critical to have the confidence of knowing answers to common questions and knowing what to say to your owners. We call that as that we put that as part of the ownership linkage plan that a board would have.
Discover a wealth of beautiful piano music composed by women throughout history, women who have rarely been heard until now. Go to pianomusicshewrote.com for several resources and to buy your copies of the newly published Piano Music She Wrote anthologies for elementary level pianists and piano students, edited by pianist Sandra Mogensen. That's pianomusicshewrote.com.
Okay, and we're back. Susan, you've been at this policy governance thing for a while now. Any thoughts around what it was like in the beginning?
It feels like it's been tough slogging all the way through since the very beginning. But one thing that I was reflecting on the other day was when I was organizing the first annual international policy governance conference, and I figured we could use some sponsors. So I reached out to a firm that finds sponsors for conferences and told them, what the conference was about and what policy governance was and all of that. And they said, great, sure, no problem. We can find you sponsors. And how much money would you like to find? And I said, 25,000 would be good. And she says, oh, that's nothing. I can raise that, for somebody's birthday party. That's no problem at all. So I'm like, great. So I give her, all the information about the conference, what policy governance is about, and they go off and make a ton of phone calls. And then she catches up with me a couple weeks later and says, okay, I want you to know that so far, every single company that we've called about this sponsorship opportunity, none of them know what policy governance is. And I'm like, really? And she says, "Yeah, we called, we have this list, this great contact list of all these Fortune 500 companies, and nobody knows what policy governance is." And I'm like, "Oh my goodness." So, well, keep trying, gave her some tips and some ideas on different types of companies or organizations to ask. And they go off and make more calls. Checks back with me 2 weeks later again and says, okay, I think we got someone, Susan. They are willing to sponsor the conference for $6,000. And I'm like, wow, that's actually pretty good. Um, and she says, "Well, it's just one little catch." And I'm like, "Okay, what's the catch?" And she says, "Well, the head of the company wants to speak at the conference." And I'm like, okay, what's he going to speak about?" And she said, "Well, he's going to just talk about what he does and what he thinks good governance is and all of that." So I dug into it a little bit more with her, and eventually, very sadly and with a heavy heart, I had to say no. The company, by the way, was AIG, and it turned out that it would have been kind of a big mistake to partner with them on a governance conference, as I later learned. So you can always Google that and find out what happened there. But in any case, it was just kind of shocking to me in the early days about how difficult it was to find people willing to invest in a conference that's all about good governance, accountability, transparency, all the things people talk about on and on and on, but seem to think that, there's no really good way of doing it. And here we have a good way of doing it, and nobody's heard of it. So, anyway, that's why we're here, right, Rob? We're going to change the world, and we're going to make a difference, right?
Well, yes, and obviously some organizations don't necessarily want good governance that brings transparency and accountability. So in other words, stick to the principles, don't sell out, and you can't go wrong.
That's right, pretty much. So, with this podcast, we're going to wrap it up now. I really want people to send us your questions. If you have any questions about governance, about the work of boards of directors, about policy governance, send them to us and we will be glad to use them on a future podcast. We'll be back in another week or so with another episode. First, thank you, Rob, very much for helping me out here, and Sandra for her help. And check out our website at browndogconsulting.com. Send us your comments, your questions, and we look forward to being with you again soon.
See you next time from the Brown Dog Consulting Studios with Policy G. Take it from me.
Thank you for listening. Please share this podcast with your friends, colleagues, and fellow board and staff members. For the show notes, choose the podcast tab at browndogconsulting.com. This episode was produced by Brown Dog Consulting, hosted by Susan Mogensen and Rob Ludlow, and edited by Sandra Mogensen. Bye for now.